in the beginning of the 20th century, there was the development. There was the development of really the beginning of what would be known as modern psychology. And unfortunately, over time, there's been this divide between spirituality and psychology, and I think that most of that divide, believe it or not, exists as a reaction to the church, or the church reacting, not so much as the science of psychology. In my own opinion and research, I find that the psychology validates faith. You can kind of go either way you want to with it, but it validates faith. And in most situations, especially pertaining to counseling psychology, it's good practice for the psychologist to direct the individual towards their faith, because we see over and again that an expression of faith seems to be something needed in human beings. Human beings are incurably religious. It's just a fact. If you look at the planet today, we have approximately 7 billion people walking the globe, and more than 93% of those people globally will affirm that there is a God. The other remaining small percentage are not all atheists, some agnostic, which typically still also affirm there is a God. So when you begin to look at atheism as a whole, at best it makes up 2% of the world's population. 2. So when you look at this 7 billion people walking the planet in 2015, with all of our modern advances of science and technology, still to this day, while the world may not agree on who God is, the world agrees that God is. Amen? And so that becomes our role as ministers of the gospel to help them to discover, as Paul did. One of the most brilliant messages he ever preached, in my opinion, is when he's out here and he's out in the book of Acts, and he walks up and he sees all of these idols, and he notices one. He says, "To the unknown God." I mean, you couldn't have got a better way of just grabbing a hold of your environment and transferring that over into the moment to share the gospel. So he says, "I see that you guys are very religious." And he wasn't saying that in an insulting way, because the word religion is not a bad word, although sometimes it's taken that idea in some people's minds. But nonetheless, he says, "Now, I see all of these idols, and you've really been concerned with pleasing God, but I've come to speak to you specifically about this one, the unknown God. We want to change that today by allowing me to introduce you to him. He has a name." Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Flowing in the Spirit. Taking something that's right there in the now and transferring it to people's needs. Yeah. Making it relevant. People in that audience had no problem paying attention to what he had to say. After all, can you imagine spending 10, 15 years of your life making offerings to the unknown God, and then a prophet shows up and says, "I know his name"? Yeah. Come on. You got everybody's attention now. Right? I mean, that would be captivated with such an idea. And so, in the same vein now, we go back to this idea. We talked about psychology and how, it's taking these different views. And in the realm of that, the word psyche finding its root in the soul of mankind. That's an interesting concept when you look at it in the Greek. It becomes a biblical term. But the reason I bring that up is the component of organizational psychology. Now, the church is an organization. It's an organization. Any group of people who are organized is an organization. And so when we talk about organizations, there's a necessity to lead. If we don't have a leader, the people perish. If we don't have a vision, the people perish. And so leadership is necessary. But as Elder Roger points out, the world's changing. I don't know what church will be in 10 years, or 20 years, or even more, 40 years from today. And we have to begin to be aware of the possibility that God would do a new thing. As strange as that may sound, I say that facetiously. He's always doing new things. I heard a new song in heaven. Not the same old-fashioned hymns that we've been singing since Grandma took us to church for the first time. A new song, right? Newness of life. Things moving forward. And so church may not, in 40 years, be anything like it was when we first started attending church as baby children. There may no longer be. In fact, we're at a day and age where church, Sunday school, is becoming something we don't do anymore. And then Sunday night service is becoming obsolete. And then Wednesday night service has become, well, we don't meet over here at the church, but we meet you know, in the homes and life groups and cell groups, which I think is a wonderful idea, frankly, in my opinion anyhow. It's closer to what actually took place in the early church.
That's right.
So as these things change, our perspectives of ministers, because first society holds the first perspective of a minister is someone who stands behind a pulpit on Sunday morning. But I can't find that pulpit ministry of Jesus. I just can't find that in the Bible. In fact, I can't find a building program.
Come on now.
You know,
Come on now.
I can't find where they had to raise funds for the next, fellowship hall. I mean, because it's not in there. In fact, when they said, Lord, I'll follow you, he says, foxes have holes. But the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head at night.
That's right. That's right.
And if he had a church and a great sanctuary, he'd have a parsonage. Any good minister would. Right? He'd have a place to lay his head at night. But instead, the reason it's transferred today, because Jesus' ministry was mobile.
Yes, it was.
It was mobile.
Yeah.
Just like the phone in your hand.
Yes, yes.
And so we have to begin to take the technology and the means of communication, whether it be your smartphone, and start some smart ministry.
Yes.
Some smart discipleship.
Yes.
And connecting with people in the way that they communicate today. Because even if you know English and you are in a Spanish congregation, what happens? If you don't know Spanish, you don't communicate. And if society changes the way they communicate, used to be a day and time where you would sit on the front porch and hope that company would interrupt you. Right? Good Sunday afternoon with a Coca-Cola and maybe some peanuts or a moon pie or something, and it was like, I'm so delighted that such and such drove by, and you sat on the porch as a means by saying, you're welcome to stop and let's have some cake or something this evening. Now, the doorbell goes off, and you didn't know anybody was coming, and you're hushing the children. Somebody's here to visit me. How rude, they didn't send me a text first. Right?
Come on.
So, we have to change the way we communicate. The old school way is dwindling. Now, I have to say, I admire the Mormons. Not necessarily for their doctrine, but I admire them for their persistence. I had the opportunity of knowing some Mormons for a period of time, and I'm very pleased with my wife because she's the only person I've ever known who actually had Mormons knock on the door and she started carrying them to church. Regular, every Wednesday night.
Wow.
So, I know. Wow, I've never seen that before. I've never pulled that off. She did. And I can tell you one thing I can identify as a success factor. It wasn't because she stood on the front porch and argued doctrine with them. You know?
Right.
It wasn't beating them upside the head with why you don't have it figured out. That ain't no way you get them to come to church, is it?
Right.
Nobody responds to that.
Right.
You know, if they even answer the door anymore. But I had a chance to go over to their apartment, and they had this map that said, there was no TV or anything, and the map was there in that apartment. It had the city that we lived in, and they had this entire area circled, and they had the map of the house numbers and everything. They were strategic in making sure that not one door was missed and that there was a regular schedule in following up with these people. Now, I mean, what can you say to that? That's organized, and that's somebody who's serious about what they're doing. You know, and as Jesus said, you know, as only a wise man, he counts the cost before he begins to build, lest he looks like a fool in the end and not have what's necessary to complete the project. And so now this model that they're using is not going to continue working. In fact, it's already hurting. But what if you had a similar model that connected with people, that exchanged text messages and Facebook updates and phone calls and the things that people talk and how they relate to each other? If you had that kind of model with this level of strategy that they had, you might actually start to get through to someone. And so we move forward into this. Now, without getting lost there, transformational leadership. It has, well, let's first start with the word transformational. Isn't that the salvation experience? It should be transforming.
Yes.
Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Yes.
And so we see there are 4 elements in the application of transformational leadership as a theory. And the reason I bring this up is because in the 20th century, beginning with Burns and then later developed more by Bass, we see transformational leadership as a theory. But guess what? Just like with Robert Greenlee, who came up with the concept of servant leadership, he somehow got coined with that term. But Jesus Christ demonstrated the application of both servant leadership, which is now called a theory, and transformational leadership, which is now called a theory, quite some time before these people ever existed in the 20th century. And that's where we want to relate that. All truth belongs to God. And if the truth belongs to God, then it's going to exist in God's presence and in His way and what He does. And so just because we find a system or a term to place on it, it was already there. It was eternal. And so we're going to give you a system because in the study of leadership theory as a whole, I find nothing more closely to the way that the gospel is taught and the way that the Bible would instruct the New Testament church to demonstrate leadership than in that of transformational leadership. And if you do any time looking into it, you'll find that just about any Christian scholar in this area will quickly step up and say, I agree. So you're in good hands on that. Now, there are 4 specific ways in which transformational leadership is applied. And we're going to cover those 4 ways today using some different speakers on these particular categories. The first one is inspirational motivation. Now, I encourage you that when you look at each one of these categories, that as we kind of explain it, name it whatever you want to name it. If inspirational motivation doesn't, appeal to your ears or just connect the dots for you, call it whatever you want. Just the point is to understand it. It's not about having this memorized as a theory, but understanding the principles and how they're applied. So, inspirational motivation. Jesus inspired people. I can't imagine how much more inspirational that anyone could be than Jesus Christ, that the disciples would all die a martyr's death for the sake of this man. Think about that. You're inspired when you'll go daily down your life and be put to death for someone. But consider this moment. Here the disciples are walking along and they're just, with Jesus and they're kind of tagging along in the back. And it says that they were kind of disputing over who would be the greatest in the kingdom. Wouldn't you love to be recorded on all the pages of history and scripture for being that knucklehead that's over here like, hey, look, buddy, I'm going to be greater than you when we get over there to the other side. Now, a good old-fashioned, well-meaning preacher would have probably turned around and said, how dare you? The Lord rebuke thee. For the first shall be last, the last shall be first. Ye are filled with pride. Repent. That would have connected with them. They'd have been inspired. Right? They'd have said, well, I'm going out to obey the Lord now. But the reality is, Jesus turns and says something very interesting. He doesn't rebuke them. In fact, for the very thing to occur in His presence says something that may not be written on the page. It says that Jesus had so much confidence in His people and loved them so dearly and connected with them so intimately that they were confident enough to have a conversation like that. Think about that. And His response wasn't, you're wrong. His response was, look, guys, I'm going to tell you how to be the greatest. You want that? No problem. Here's the path. What did He do? He inspired to take the next step. First shall be last. Intellectual stimulation. Intellectual stimulation is the concept of stirring a person's thoughts. One of the best ways to do this is through rhetoric. Here's an example from Christ. Rhetoric being a rhetorical question, maybe. Let's say a question that's not intended to be answered. What shall it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? And then just sit quietly. Now, we've heard that quite a few times. But imagine being there in the presence of Jesus and seeing Him, looking Him in the eye, and having Him ask a question like that, and you're hearing it for the first time. It's a lot to think about. That would be overwhelming. And so the idea becomes that with intellectual stimulation, the goal is to bring a person's thoughts into being captivated, to being a necessity to find an answer to a question, and finding that answer is the goal, because the answer starts with the heart, is where Jesus was leading them. And so something to keep in mind is that at the core of all of these principles, the idea is to A, lead an individual or group of people, in our case, closer to God, but towards the objectives of the organization. So in this case, we'll say the church, speaking just in a loose term. The objectives of God, the objectives of the kingdom of heaven, and even maybe more specific in the organization of that local body. But then in the process of doing it, the objective also becomes to help the individual to grow. It's discipleship. It's not just salvation and drop off after we count the numbers, but it's the making of the whole minister, the whole person. And so that intellectual stimulation should really be the kind of thing that not brings them into, the complexities of predispensationalism and, sublapsarianism and free will and all these other things. That's not what we mean by intellectual stimulation. What we mean is taking the intellect of the mind and bringing it to a place of stimulating thought that connects it to the heart. That's what we mean by intellectual stimulation. Y'all see the difference?
Yeah.
Okay? Because we can play with philosophical mind candy all day and get nowhere. But when that comes in here and you start thinking, wow, what does that mean about this right here? We're getting somewhere. Right? Now, you think back on Oral Roberts University. Oral Roberts University, he didn't go out there and raise all that money by appealing to men's logic. Right? It wasn't by logical arguments that he raised the money that he did over there. And even Hobby Lobby, I believe, gave him $100 million. So that's impressive. But instead, he connected the mind to the heart and inspired people. And that's what invokes people to change, to transformation. The next one is individualized consideration. Individualized consideration is just a big term. Make it simple. It's about knowing a person individual and appreciating that person individual.
Yes.
It's about saying this person has these qualities and these skills and these strengths and these gifts that's been given to them by the Spirit. And saying now I have to deal with that person in leadership as an individual. Not as just a big flock of cattle somewhere, but I have to connect with this person individually and pour into their individual strengths to see them grow. Right? Now we see that with Jesus. Often you see that he goes off and there are a few people who are with him, not all 12. Anybody can name 3? Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John, right? What's going on there? Why would just these 3 be? Is it because they're his favorites? I don't know. I'd like to say no, but look, I really don't know, because the Bible doesn't say. But you see them over here being off to the side with a little special time with Jesus. And you can't escape the fact that such a thing would have to mean that he's individually pouring into them. You can see it more specifically with Peter.